welcome to the Wellbeing Show. Good to have you back here towards the end of April 2021, where things are beginning to look up in terms of the whole COVID thing, particularly in Europe. I'm Noel, I'm your host, and I'm joined by Jude this evening. And so I will tell you why I made that mistake later on. It's appropriate to the show. But anyway, I'm joined by Jude this evening, who's going to introduce himself later, themselves later, and we've got a great show ahead, discussing some really important issues around gender and gender identity. Just before we get going, though, just to remind you, it's a live show. You're welcome to join us on any one of the social media platforms that we use: Facebook Live, Twitter through Periscope, and also on YouTube. Unfortunately, you can't phone in for this show because I'm in foreign climes with my boy, hence the sort of Golden Gate Bridge behind me. I'm not actually in America, but if you call, because my computer's tethered to my phone, it'll just shut the show off. So please don't call. So that's the only way I've got broadband is through the phone at the moment. So anyway, jumping off that and into hello, Jude.
Hi.
Hey, Jude.
Hey. I get that so much now.
I know, but you chose the name. You live with it.
I did.
It's not like something gave you.
Power moment on the day that I was deciding whether or not to have it, and that song came on. I thought,
why did I choose this name? It's a lovely name. That's a good choice. So, so good to see. It's been bloody ages since I've last seen you.
Thank you.
How's it been this year? Have you been coping through the whole sort of COVID lockdown stuff?
I hate to say it, but I've had the best year of my life. And as much as I know it's been so tough for so many people and awful and traumatic and tragic, I've really thrived in the last year, and for many reasons that we spoke about previously. But I feel that there was, this kind of pandemic, it kind of brought out the worst and the best in people, and really brought out a lot of trauma, but also helped people to kind of see it, and see what they needed to face and look at. And that was the case for me, and it was kind of the real cherry on the cake for me, I'd say.
Right. So you sort of been faced with yourself and decided you like yourself.
Oh, it was so bizarre, honestly. The way you couldn't write it just everything that happened just happened in such a perfect way. It as much as it was difficult because I had to leave the home that we were in all of a sudden as soon as the pandemic hit. I had no work coming in, real stress and anxiety. And I stayed at a friend's flat that was free in London and ended up there for 7 weeks, but then was broken up with. And of course, like my natural reaction to when I get broken up with, being a serial relationship dater, one would say possibly love addict and codependent, is that I jump into another relationship. And the beauty of the lockdown meant that I couldn't go anywhere. So I was stuck in this flat.
Just the only relationship you could have was with yourself. Good Lord.
It was, I had to go through the hump first. The hump was very, there were nightmares, PTSD, all the stuff that I was running away from being in these relationships really hit me. But it was one of those moments where it was just, I went through it, I didn't go around it, run away from it. I went through it and I came through the other side. Right. It was definitely gradual, but I focused on mind, body and spirit. And I actually Googled, I was at desperation trying to find ways and resources to help me. And I actually stumbled across meditation, wonderful, it's called The Law of Attraction, that I thought was a fad and a load of rubbish, but it ties into metacognitive therapy and belief systems. And I began to practice it. Just made a vision board of how I'd like to see my life, and the vision board started coming to fruition, believe it or not. I had Vogue plunked up on my vision board and I thought, I'm going to become a model, was my thing. I'm going to become a model. That's what's going to happen. Fast forward a month later and it's exactly what happened.
I mean, one of the more annoying things about you is that in every single incarnation of you, you've been drop dead gorgeous, which is just like, it's just one of the things that the rest of us are incredibly jealous of and envious of. So, you're one of the few people I know that can do these transitions and just be completely beautiful, whichever gender you decide to be.
That's very kind of you.
Really, if you want to, if you're annoyed with Jude as much as I am, you can turn around and slap him anytime you want, quite frankly.
I have to say, the most empowering narrative, I think, for me was the fact that I was very badly bullied at school. And my nickname at school was Ugly Duckling, believe it or not. So I
No.
wanted for the way that I looked at school, and bullied and called a boy and all this kind of stuff for, expressing myself in the way that I wanted to express myself. And so, like, I developed, I think, a lot of shame around that sort of sense of identity and being seen as a boy. And it wasn't who I was wasn't reflected externally. I mean, it was illegal to even talk about or share or promote any kind of LGBT knowledge.
That's right. Yes, I remember that. I remember those days.
Well, throughout my
And
school,
the Thatcher government changed the law and said that you can't positively promote any, do they call it alternative family structures or something? Is that
yeah,
ridiculous?
no LGBT literature, nothing in any public services.
Yeah.
And it was up until I was 17, and so there was just no education, there was no awareness. I didn't really know anyone like me. There was no social media, there was no
Yeah.
like readily accessible information by which to kind of really identify myself, or just know that it was okay to be who I was. And so I think that's just the side of myself that I shut away, and I tried very hard to kind of adapt myself to become a version of who I thought the world wanted me to be.
Yeah.
For X amount of years, well, up until 3.5 years ago, really. And that's just been, this process had been ongoing. But if I have to say, in this last year, it's been so empowering, because obviously going into this industry where I'm celebrating my aesthetic, but also my identity, the way I look, the fact that, expressing myself the way I want to express myself just feels so good. It's just rewriting the narrative to so much trauma for me. And so, I think modeling can mean, some like just people acting as clothes horses to some people and not mean very much to them, but actually to me it's just such a
But to be honest, every model I've known has been sort of socially aware. Maybe it's just the models I know, but are out there making some very important points about what we do to people and how we destroy them through image and so on, and how we need to change that narrative so that people can own themselves and love themselves. And that's the key thing that we need to do. So, and I mean, sort of for those that don't know that, I may be wondering what Jude and I are talking about. The area that we're in is talking about gender identity, transsexuality, intersexuality, and sort of everything in between, if there is anything in between. So when I first met Jude was called Jules. And that was a long time ago now. I mean, sort of not quite when dinosaurs are walking past.
Well,
you're still a child in comparison to me. But,
wow.
Oh, God, you are. Get out of here, mate. Don't even go there with me. Sort of fishing for a compliment and got it.
There you go.
Still able to bat the eyelids and get people to do what you want. But yeah, we met when you identified as a woman at that point, and comfortably so, I think, in many ways.
And I do, and I'm very honest about that. And I say to the people, because I do talks on the subject, and I say, some trans people don't like to talk about their past, but I do, and I feel very comfortable in doing so. And I'm kind of a bit of an open book when it comes to this topic, because I'm very passionate about raising awareness and kind of saying it how it was. But I did, the majority of my life, in fact, 30 years of my life, I spent identifying as female and thinking that's who I was. And actually, until I was, and it's funny because for those of us in recovery who have been through the recovery process and have gone, into a meeting or into a session, and they've heard people speak and they've said, oh, you're like me, and you have that process of identification where you figure out who you are based on someone else's experience. Well, that's exactly what happened to me. I met my first trans people, if you like, and that's when the penny dropped for me. And not to be a stereotype, it happened in Brighton because I moved to Brighton. But there I met, and I happened to go to an evening called the Museum of Transology, which was a museum and an exhibition of trans objects. And there were hundreds of trans people there. So I literally had a crash course in, who I am, and through hundreds of trans people at once. And it was really enlightening. It was overwhelming because I just didn't know where to start at that point, but I knew that I identified with these people, and I was trying to figure myself out through all these other people. And one thing that I learned, and I'm still learning, is that I learned very early on to kind of look outside and look externally to try and validate myself and find a sense of self. And what part of my, not just recovery, codependent recovery, all my everything that I'm doing is to actually learn to go inside and listen to that inner voice that I've been ignoring for so many years to find out who I am. And I've had to do that, and it's just been, and it's been reclaiming that autonomy that was taken away from me, as a child, because our children, they already have a sense of who they are and who they're going to be, and I feel like that's kind of stripped away from them in the society that we live in one way or another. I think this kind of applies to all of us in some way, if you know what I mean.
I mean, we're talking before the show, and I think maybe we'll bring that conversation up now. We can come back to the sort of trauma issues and the addiction issues later, I think, and that'd be useful to unpack some of that, because ultimately that's how you and I got to know each other, from those communities, and the links between the various things. But I think one of the interesting conversations we started before the show was to ask and begin to remember some of the history and her story and their story that existed prior to our current period in Western sort of hegemonic thinking and binary thinking about sort of gender, and what certainly gender, I think most people these days accept, is socially constructed. Okay, I mean, I think most people wouldn't argue that, most sensible people. But then the whole idea of trans is relatively new for a lot of people, but it's not new for the human race.
Absolutely not. And that's something that's been lost. It's a history that isn't taught in our schools. And why would it be? Because we glorify a lot of the kind of key events that we consider important, but we don't learn this in history. And it wasn't until I actually stumbled across an amazing Guardian article that spoke about like indigenous cultures, Native Americans, kind of colonialism cultures that used to actually celebrate and hold gender diverse people, LGBTQ people in very high regard. They were considered counselors, wise people. And I found that fascinating. And it wasn't until a kind of more religious Christian like communities from France, Spain, Europe came over and condemned these people as sodomites and, essentially silence this part of history. And it's, it's not new. That's the thing. And it's almost like we're making this rediscovery of who we were. And they had such a wise outlook about diversity in general. And this society is just so rigid and so binary. And I question, when we've got 7+ billion people on the face of the planet, and not two identical twins are entirely the same, everyone's different in one way or another. Why do we find this concept of diversity just so difficult to comprehend? Because actually, we are diverse by nature. We're all one, but we're all
well, diversity is what nature wants, and diversity is health. The way I often explain it to people is this: if you imagine two farms, both have 5 fields. In one, they farm all the same crop in all 5 fields. In the other, they farm 5 different crops. Which is the better, healthier farm? Well, the one that has the diverse range of crops, obviously. And that's also true neurologically for us as human beings, and culturally as human beings. It's also on a species level. And I guess I don't really expect people to have this sort of level of knowledge, but it's fairly standard in the animal kingdom, the fish kingdom, the birds, etc., for there to be a range of options in terms of sexual bodies. So there'll be what we would call female, there'll be trans bodies, there'll be what we would call male, and other variants of that, simply because that makes sense from a biological perspective. And there's also asexual bodies that can change from one to the other. And again, it just makes sense from a survival perspective. And given that we're good at survival, it would be bonkers. So I'm going to introduce some other terms that people might not have heard, but sort of hermaphroditism is a word, which I'm sure you've come across, Jude. Now, what most people don't know, again, I wouldn't expect people to, is that the sexual markers in humans, there's over 40 of them. And the genitalia, which is the one that everybody points at usually, are only a small number of them, and probably the least important definers of biological gender. So, but biological gender, if there is such a thing, but biological sex is much more complicated than genitalia, and it in and of itself. And there are many options within that. And it's a bit like, have you heard of the Kinsey Scale?
No.
Okay, the Kinsey was a researcher into sexual identity, and came up with this concept of this scale where some people were definitely heterosexual at one end of the scale, and some people were definitely homosexual at the other end of the scale, but most people were somewhere in between. Some people were right in the middle, but you might have been more towards one side or more towards the other, and those that were, and that's the same for biology.
Absolutely.
It's just a simple fact.
Biology, and you can reflect that to gender. So it's the same for sex. It's the same for gender. It's the same for sexuality. I believe we all exist on some form of spectrum in every aspect, and I think it's a great way to look at it as an umbrella, as a spectrum, as a scale. Like you have all these shades of of grey, of diversity in the middle, and people can just fall on each and every one of them, and it be unrelated. Like I think it's a myth that like so many people get sexuality and gender diversity kind of mixed up. They just assume that it's related, that the LGBT community is about being gay, and it's not. It's about your gender isn't associated to your sexuality. Like my sexuality has changed over time. I'm actually, and I'm not afraid to say, sexually attracted to men too since transitioning. And that's really common. I found that fascinating because I was like, what is that? Why has that happened? And so many trans people I know are attracted to same sex or multiple sexes. And it kind of really kind of myth busts that idea that, it's somehow related and we're somehow changing our gender just to be more socially acceptable in terms of our sexuality. No, that's not it. We're so much more complex than that as human beings.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that, and again, I'm old enough to remember this stuff. You're not yet, but I remember the 70s, and when questions about gender and identity were really being asked for the first time seriously in sort of our generation. It hadn't been asked really historically properly before that since 17th, 16th, 17th centuries. And the 16th century, for people that don't know, again, a little bit of background info, was when the Bible, which up till then had been written in Latin, the Christian Bible, up to then had been written in Latin, and most people didn't read. They certainly didn't know how to read Latin, and the monks would transcribe the letters. They would copy them literally from one book to another. But then the Bible started being translated into indigenous languages. The first time was in German, I think, and then into British with the development of the printing presses. And with that translation came the issues of how do you translate the meaning of specific words? And of course, this is the politics of translation. It reflected the politics of each country, particularly the gender politics and the definitions of certain words that were translated to mean man and woman, one being subservient to the other, which wasn't necessarily in the original writing of the Bible, but it was politically necessary at the time to do that. Hence, and of course, you then had things like the witch trials and all this sort of stuff, and it was very much the hegemony of how property was property rights were passed on through the patrilineal line, and then that was exported, as you said, internationally by the Spanish, the Portuguese, the British through empire. And when they were confronted by, say, indigenous populations in North America, which had a minimum of 3 genders, usually, but usually quite a lot more than that, and they were decimated. I mean, absolutely decimated, and seen as savages and less than human, because they celebrated diversity.
And it's so interesting as well because it's almost like that people cottoned on to the fact that religion had such a power over people, and so they found forms of basically infiltrating forms of control over people by kind of like mistranslating religion, which I'm sure stemmed from a very inclusive spirituality actually, and it's just kind of been made very rigid, and now it's kind of affected our culture for generations. Like all this discrimination that we still experience today is kind of formed on these ideas that
and we can think of it intersectionally as well. I mean, the idea that Jesus is white is completely bonkers.
There you go. Yeah.
I mean, sort of where the hell does that come from? He was in the Middle East,
Yeah.
a Semite in the Middle East. I mean, what bit of your insane sort of racist brain thinks that this person could have been white?
And
It's like bonkers, isn't it?
It's unbelievable, and it just shows us how much we've been brainwashed in this society. When I bring up, these kind of concepts in schools or businesses, it's like people are almost looking at me sometimes like I'm like, I'm the crazy one. What are you talking about? And I'm just thinking, no, like this is the truth. This is the stuff that you've been distanced from, you've been kept away from, and we've essentially been brainwashed. We're part of.
Well, they say history is written by the victors, right? So, and we should be aware that there has been a power struggle going on. Very definitely, there's been a power struggle going on, and we're seeing sort of liberationist stuff happening. And again, we were talking just before the show, thinking about the U.S. election and what Biden, some of the first things Biden did, appointing a trans person to his cabinet, rolling back some of the divisive legislation. But let's talk about, as though you and I are not as enlightened as we are, and not as right on as we are. And let's sort of talk maybe about some of the sort of straightforward, simple stuff that might cause people cause for concern. I don't know why, but so I mean, it tends to be in the tabloids. We get these sort of tabloid newspapers about worries about changing rooms in swimming pools, and somebody suddenly deciding, some hulking bloke deciding he's a woman all of a sudden, and then winning all the women's races and all that sort of stuff. It's trivialization of the issues, I know, but I think that's where people are coming at it from, and I guess you come across that a lot in terms of the sort of training that you do.
So much so, and this is, these. I mean, I have to say that the right-wing media has a huge responsibility in the way that it paints the trans community, and it's it's done well at kind of really tainting and poisoning the minds of so many people across the country. It's got a huge responsibility, because we spoke earlier about the very high rates of mental health issues in the community, addiction, farm suicide, and this this isn't just the adult community. This extends to the younger community, and I'd argue that the reason for that is the ignorance, the lack of support and understanding, the amount of discrimination that is still considered as socially acceptable, even at the level of the media, for example, and a lot of the time unaccepting families, and actually that's the trauma that this community has to deal with. And I think it's fed by these kind of false ideas that the media just kind of feed to people about the trans community. I mean, I didn't know a trans person. I know hundreds now, and I mean hundreds. I don't know any kind of perpetrator burly men dressed in wigs going around like infiltrating women's bathrooms and trying to.
I've not come across it yet.
It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist, and if there's been one case in one prison one time, I think parents evening asked me once about this, there was a trans person that attacked somebody in a female prison. Now, but my argument was, well, how many cisgender people have attacked people in prisons? You're giving me one example, like, really? And that's going to represent the entire community. Like, it's just, and they will nitpick at these examples to try and kind of argue them against us. And then the question of sport is just, again, like, I'll hear radio reports on, like, these unfair advantages that trans people have, and I just think, well, what's your argument to be exclusive of marginalized people? Is that your answer? You're just going to say, no, you can't do it, we can because we're privileged, and you can't because you're not. And so we get to play the game. That's just like, that's not okay to communicate in that way, like, to really, I think as well, again, we're coming back to diversity, the fact we're all different shapes, sizes, strengths, genetics, foot sizes for swimmers. Like, people are just diverse. Like, Caster Semenya produces a high amount of testosterone. No, we shouldn't just medicate her in order for her to compete. That's not okay either. Like, this is the human body, like you rightly referred to earlier on. Like, That's how the body works. It's sport that's exclusive and only catered for, the majority of
Yeah.
able-bodied people.
It's interesting. I mean, I think that the question of sports is an interesting one because people are having arguments about a tiny minority of the population, high-class sports people, as though they're normal. And there's nothing normal about an Olympic-level sports person. It's not me. It's not the normal population. And the idea that that is held up as everyday human sort of biology is bonkers. It's absolutely. How on earth are you using that as a standard example of a human body? Because that's definitely not. That's somebody who has set out on a lifelong mission to adapt their body to a specific regime to achieve specific results.
Absolutely.
That's not a natural set phenomenon at all. There's sort of like ridiculous sort of argument to be made. I think for me, I remember when the Olympics came to London last time, and I remember it a lot because it came to the edge of the Olympic Park is on the edge of Hackney where I live, and I didn't get to see the main Olympics, but I did go to the other Olympic Games, which was for non-able-bodied sports personalities, Paralympics. And it's the best sports I've ever seen, for one. And there was nothing about it that was based on any sort of norms. So they had a very complex structure in the Paralympics. So I remember being in the swimming and seeing the British girl who won roundly in the swimming pool. I happened to be there that day. And there were a whole range of bodies in the pool. And they had a complex system of scoring that went on, which compensated for the different abilities, and then gave you some of the most exciting sports you're ever going to see. And I'm like, I just have no time for somebody who simplifies it all and says that that Usain Bolt is a normal human. He's not. That's why he's winning the gold medals, because he's not normal. I'm normal. I'd be nowhere. He'd kick my ass, quite frankly.
Absolutely.
And the idea that that is what sports is nonsense, because go to Paralympics. It's the most amazing sports you're ever going to see. And I'm going to say something even more sort of controversial here. The best ever football I've seen is in the women's league, not the men's league. And I just dump the men's league. The women's cup final was on the other weekend. Best football you ever see, to be honest. And I can't wait for the trans cup final, because that's going to be really interesting football, really skilled. So all of these arguments, I just think, piss off, go away. So it's just people trying to get attention. It's nonsense.
And in the fact that they get aired as well, and that's the issue. It's like, I worry at who that affects. And I've just, I've been involved with certain community projects and events where trans people are portrayed as thugs, violent thugs, when in fact nothing violent, nothing thug-like was going on.
Jude, I should warn people about Jude, one of the most violent thugs in the world.
That was on the front of the Daily Mail when it was just, I held a few banners and just like stood for our rights, because trans people basically trying to exclude us. And what happens, and then unfortunately, the parents of trans children will read those front pages, and that's the problem. And then they'll start being concerned for their young people. They won't fully understand the topic, and then and that's the issue. And that's why I'm so passionate about getting out to as many schools, young people, businesses. And that's what I've been doing. I've genuinely been getting out there. I was on Zoom to
and let's talk about the reality of it, because up until 2019, being trans was defined as a mental illness, and of course it's not. And there is a history of abuse through mental health services, and people being incarcerated, having enforced operations on them, etc., etc. I mean, up until very recently, unless I think stopped 10 years ago, hermaphroditic babies were surgically operated on at birth by the decision of the surgeon. Would randomly make a decision about which sex they wanted to assign to that hermaphrodite, rather than wait till they grew up and made their own decision.
Yeah,
So I mean, things have moved, but sort of that was the framing of it, was that trans was ill.
yeah,
It was
absolutely. And I think like into intersex people as well who are still operate, I believe they're still being operated on, as far as I'm aware. They are still considered to have a disorder, which, you know, and whereas the trans community, you know, finally that kind of, that's been acknowledged as not being a mental health issue like gender identity disorder, but intersex people are still fighting for their right. And again, it's funny how, like, if you go through the LGBTQIA plus spectrum, like, you know, lesbian and gay community had to fight for their rights, fight for their existence, fight for, you know, and there's still in inequality. Like, it's more socially acceptable, for example, than it is to necessarily identify as trans. And the trans community are facing what the gay and lesbian community were facing back in the 80s in terms of like the lack of understanding, you know, the association to paedophilia. There's a lot of that goes on, you know, how they're being condemned and being portrayed in the media, the fact that it's considered a choice, all that was aimed at the gay and lesbian community, you know, and so next in line is the trans community, and then behind us is the intersex community. It's almost like each sort of minority group is coming to the forefront and going through the same process through history. You know, interesting, isn't it, that we're still cyclical.
And the reality behind, I mean, it's interesting as well. I mean, it's sad, it's a tragedy that the reality behind the headlines that talk about that one person who was abusing people and claimed trans identity. The reality behind that headline is the thousands upon thousands of kids who are trans, who many of whom will end up in a very damaged psychological position because they see themselves as bad and damaged in some way, are afraid to be honest about who they are, afraid to talk about who they are, and may end up harming themselves. And people in the trans community are more of a risk to themselves than anybody else through self-harm, addiction, suicide, etc. And that's always the case. That's always the case. They are victims, not perpetrators. In terms of thinking about, because you're no longer a victim, but you've been through that experience. Do you mind if we sort of circle back a little bit to talk about some of the sort of trauma issues and the addiction issues?
And I wanted to throw a quick stat out there, because the recent statistics of trans youth from under the age of 26 have attempted suicide. So it's a 48% of young trans people under the age of 26 said they have attempted suicide. So it's not even thought about, it's attempt, which is, I mean, half of the community. And that's those that have reported it have been brave enough to speak up and say that.
Yeah, I mean, in the non-trans community, it's less than 10%.
There you go. So if you just think of that statistic, it's astronomically high. But yeah, absolutely. And I can talk back at, you know, my kind of experience growing up, because interesting.
Well, let's just underline that point. And I'm going to ask people this. What world do you want to live in, really? Do you want to live in a world where kids are trying to kill themselves because you won't allow them to use certain types of words? It's like, really, is that the world you want to live in, people?
And
they've done
it in the States. They've done the studies to show if you support a young person through their transition sooner, they're happier later on in life. They've done that research in America. That's been done. That's been proven. There you go. And that's, you know, that shows supporting.
Maybe we need the research on one level, but we don't need the research, do we? We don't. We know. I mean, come on, people. We know that if you love your children, and it's your children we're talking about, that's it. You know, you accept them as they are and let them support them so that they grow and discover who they are, and that's it. End of conversation. The idea that your child has to fit your own prejudices is appalling.
Absolutely. And arguably, I think we can learn a lot from young people. I think they're the most authentic versions of people that there are, because before they get turned into the social conditioning that we all go through, like they already know. Like I already knew looking back, and I actually lost myself through growing up in this world, if anything, and had to rediscover. It's almost like growing down and rediscovering who it was that I was originally after having gone through this absolute car crash. You know.
I think there's also something So let's deal with a sort of fantasy I think a lot of people have, and then we'll come back to your personal experience if that's right. But there's this sort of fantasy I think that some people have that if we do discuss these things openly, what will happen is it'll spread like some illness, and people will catch it. And it's the opposite is true. Certainly, my experience as a pretty boring 54-year-old straight overweight bloke who's been around the block more times than I care to imagine. So the conversations I have around these issues have been interesting, and they've helped me think about who I am and consolidated my understanding of myself. I haven't sort of in any way, because so much of this, as you say, is very much about the stuff inside that we come to understand about ourselves.
Yeah.
And where we sort of look at the programming we've had, some aspects of it we'll accept and some we won't. And all that's happened for me is I've become healthier and happier about myself and fatter. That's the bit I'm going to need to sort that out, but that's COVID. Anyway, none of us can be as pretty as you. Coming back to your story, Jude, so you were a little girl, prepubescent, but sort of labelled tomboy and ugly duckling and all that sort of stuff. Now that's, to be honest, it's a story I've heard a lot. It's really sad. I've heard this a lot, but sort of, can you remember back to those times, what it was like, all of that? So, and what was sort of your experience of like gender and identity at that point?
I think, and it's interesting because I had a dressing up box actually, which is a way that where I used to sort of explore my expression. I used to wear shirt and ties, but I do it sort of in the privacy of my own home. So behind closed doors was somewhere where I felt able to explore, an aesthetic that I felt more comfortable with. It's not to say that I was going to be trans, like so many of us like to wear many different things, but
exactly.
I think, yeah, absolutely. I think for me at that time, it definitely was like that, me exploring a side of myself that I felt unsafe to explore outside. But when I did sort of like, take the risk and cut my hair short and go to school like that, that's when I was bullied. And, I was different, as many of us are, but like, I was a very easy target for bullies and just presenting in that way. And I think, not, like I said earlier, not having that reflection of myself externally, like I already had a lot of shame, and I grew up in quite a traumatic environment with my family structure as well. So, I had a very high stress environment at school, at home, all this kind of going on. And I just internalized so much shame. I had so much shame wrapped around the side of myself. And then I figured out, like, as I was growing older, that I also wasn't straight. I was attracted to other girls. So I had that whole shame. I remember swearing to myself that I'd never tell anybody about that. And so I just had this entire sense of shame of who I was on the inside, and really just closed that person in a box and tried to conform as best I could, looking at on the outside of who I thought I should be. And, I was a very, very unhappy person for a very long time. I had a very, very, I'm not poor meing because I'm incredibly free and happy today, but it was a very, very tough experience and tough existence growing up. But it's given me a hell of a lot of resilience and insight.
Well, I know you're not in the pity party, and I'm asking these questions because I think you will go into anything like that. But I'd like people to understand though what it's like for a child there, and because a lot of it is completely avoidable if we are accepting of children and their natural exploration of their identity. Which is what we're talking about. So what did you do? I mean, you bottled it up, but how did it express itself, this sadness? And
I had to find coping mechanisms, to cope. And I remember I had tics from a very early age, like clearing throat tics, very high anxiety, like stress in my throat. So I had a lot of, trauma and stuff trapped in my body and unable, kind of without an outlet, I suppose. And I kind of describe it as a bit of like a pressure cooker of emotions just ready to sort of explode, which is exactly what happened in my adolescence, and I found those ways to cope. And for me, that was drugs and alcohol, people that I attached to. And I found ways to kind of anesthetize a lot of that stuff. But it did explode, it exploded at times that I was taking substances. And, you know, I'd harm myself and you know, put myself in very dangerous positions. But there was this kind of like romanticism with the danger, because it was, you know, I struggled to exist, you know, I struggled to cope on a day-to-day basis. And so
And do you mind?
yeah.
Obviously, you'll tell me to shut up and leave it alone if you don't want to talk about it. But I mean, adolescence would be classically a time when, for trans,
Mhm.
the changes in body would be really challenging. If they're not, if your body isn't changing into the one that feels comfortable, that you identify with most, that's that's got to be hard work, Jude.
And I'm so glad you brought that up, because it is the time when it's hugely triggering for trans people, is puberty, when your body actually changes. Um,
Yeah.
Mine did, you know, I was really curvy, and it was just so, I can't tell you how uncomfortable it felt for my body to change in that way. And that's
Yeah,
in the,
because you would have got, I mean, in the almost ideal female form, in one sense, the form that was, I'm not blowing smoke up your ass, but the form that was really valued culturally and societally, it was defined as sexy. It would have been defined as very, very sexy. And I sort of knew that person, and it's not how I knew you, but it was striking. And to be in that sort of body and feel uncomfortable with it would have been, I can't imagine how confusing that would be, because on one level you're getting all these probably some intrusive horrible shit, but you're also because of your sexual identity at the time, you would have also got a lot of attention that you liked as
well, yeah,
well.
it was bizarre, because it's like I was constantly battling with why I found it uncomfortable to
Yeah.
associate my sexuality as well. Like, I didn't understand why I found, because when I've obviously, and not knowing, the fact that I didn't know is utterly bizarre to me. Like, it just goes to show, like, the fact that inside I knew, but I didn't know, like I wasn't conscious and aware, or knew that I was trans. Absolutely not. Like, but when I found out, the penny dropped to so many different things. It's like, oh, of course I didn't feel like a lesbian because I wasn't one, you know, because I wasn't female. Of course, like, and the eating disorders as well. That's another thing. And of course, that's really high in the trans community also, is eating disorders. Not surprising at all. Is the controlling of the curves. You know, I was trying to control my curves and the parts of myself I found so deeply uncomfortable. But of course the penny just dropped to so many things when I looked back, and that, oh, I'm trans, and then that related to that, and it's just like everything, all the dots sort of joined together, and I was like, it now makes so much sense. But I genuinely felt like I was going through the world blind, like I didn't know.
What do you think? What do you think Jude would have been like if Jude had gone to that sort of trans conference at the age of 5 or 6? Well, we can't know, but what do you imagine would have happened?
If
Or
I'd
7 or 8 or 12
yeah,
or 13 or whatever it is.
like, been able to discover myself sooner, I would have avoided. I 100% would have avoided. I think I would have needed to unpick the shame around it. I think I would have had a lot of internalized transphobia, even if I'd known back then. I would have been
Yeah.
terrified of telling anyone, or acknowledging it. If I could have what I've got today much younger, I 100% would have grown up a much healthier and happier person. My recovery would have been a lot easier, because I did, you know, I did a good 7.5, well, hang on, more than that, about 10 years of, you know, recovery in pain and like white knuckling, and no surprise that I ended up in other cross addictions, because of course, like, I would have had to have found other ways to cope with the discomfort. And it's, I think, absolutely no coincidence that the 1 year after my top surgery, and it's summer and I'm in Italy, and I'm connecting with myself, and I'm going internally and having a spiritual awakening for the first time. I don't think that's any mistake either. I think it finally, I aligned to myself, and therefore everything fit into place, and I'm finally experiencing the kind of recovery that people used to talk about in my early days, and I couldn't really properly understand, because it was just impossible to be in like so much kind of emotional, physical and social discomfort and experience the joys of recovery. Like, and that's not to say that people that haven't had surgery or gone through the process of transition can't experience recovery, but for me, absolutely needed this to be I needed to be in myself to truly
Yeah.
recover. And I would
Yeah.
describe it as a journey of recovery to self-discovery. It's all been part and parcel of the same thing. you know, finding out what belongs to me and what doesn't, you know, the childhood trauma, the social conditioning, all the shit, and saying me as myself, as Jude, and perfect as I am, happy and free, you know, and it's just wonderful, honestly wonderful.
Yeah, and I've seen the pictures that you put out as a model, promoting the sort of trans images. They're striking and gorgeous. I mean, really, really moving and touching. I mean, it's beautiful stuff.
And I
Sort of, I'm gonna have to say this because I know you personally. I remember talking to you about it, and you were like, "Oh, should I do it?" And I'm like, "Well, I can't really tell you whether you should do it or not." But it was extraordinary, sort of time. I mean, sort of really touching and moving to sort of even being a small part of it, just as somebody knew you vaguely. But I mean, really, sort of, it's amazing. I mean, my first experience of sort of trans culture was reading April Ashley's story. I don't know if you know. Do you know April Ashley? Was a trans female and became an international model. Really interesting book to read. Beautiful story about that, and she did what a lot of early trans people did in those days, which she had to leave her home country to get the operations done, and she got them done in Brazil and stuff like that. And particularly because of the transformation she was making from sort of male to female, it was, you know, Brazil was the obvious choice, it being the plastic surgery capital for the female form on the planet. So that's where you'd go. But I sort of, the point being this, that and sort of people, again, they trivialize the whole issue. Being trans isn't, you can't just walk up to a doctor and say, "Do you mind just operating on me, please? I just feel a bit odd about myself." It's like, it just doesn't, you don't go to your GP and just put yourself into the local trans clinic, although I'm glad we have trans clinics now. It's a long overdue. But do you mind talking about that process, what it's like? Because I mean, it's bizarre in the media. You'd imagine that, like, the way it works is you wake up one morning and on a whim go and have loads of hormone replacements.
And it's so fun.
It's like insane what people think. But do you mind telling us a little bit about actually doing?
And they also say there's a lot of headlines that say that we just give drugs to kids, which means it's them saying
right, because that's what we do.
We also don't do that, because
that's right.
They might, you know, they go through a whole process, don't they? They get seen, assessed, professionals, psychologists, counselors, then, you know, they might be put on puberty blockers to stop the process of puberty, which we've just described as incredibly,
so that they don't kill themselves.
They don't kill themselves, and then they might get put on
the evidence shows that the process of puberty is traumatic. Okay,
exactly. They don't have to go through this comfort and all.
That's not just a kid waking up one day and go to their GP and say, "Have some hormone blockers, please." Oh yeah, here you go.
No, they go and they have their hormones and surgery later on in their adolescence anyway. It's
absolutely.
And so it doesn't.
What were the sort of hoops you had to jump through? Do you mind? I don't want to ask you if it's uncomfortable.
And I'll be absolutely honest, because we've got, I mean, a severely underfunded NHS, and of course, like, you know, small percentages of the population are going to be last on the pecking order, which does mean that the waiting lists in this country are astronomically long. Like they're good 4 years wait before you even get an assessment. And of course, when you're faced with life or death situation, for some people, it's just not an option. There are private, I had to go through various private pathways to actually access surgery. I actually went through fundraising to raise for my surgery, because I just couldn't wait. And I actually started self-medicating with hormones. That's the way I did it. But then the doctor prescribed me because duty of care, and you know, often they'll see it as like, we get it, you know, it can be life or death. And so now I'm prescribed. I luckily found that loophole and got prescribed and go through the NHS. But yeah, so a combination of NHS and private care, without having gone through the official gender identity waiting list. I mean, I was on it for 1.5 years, and then there was an admin error and I had to start again, and I just thought, I can't I can't wait, you know.
You're saying that almost apologetically. I mean, I think it's disgusting that happened.
Yeah, absolutely.
For something with such a high mortality rate, if half of another set of young people were trying to kill themselves, who would be expecting them to wait just to get on a waiting list? I mean, that's just bonkers, isn't it?
Can't wait.
You know?
People do kill themselves because they can't wait, and that is just such a shame.
Yeah.
And
I'm glad you managed to get the money and be creative enough to, and sort of, you know, because I do know you, I'm seeing the changes in you, and the changes that are significant are not necessarily the physical ones, they are to you, but not to me. As somebody who you know, loves you very much, the changes that are significant are that you've become happier, and you definitely are.
I know.
It's like wonderful to see.
And I do see it aesthetically weirdly. I see it in my it's funny, I look over
Because you're vain.
yeah, I'm so vain. But I look at my eyes and I see this like deadness behind the eyes, and it's even brighten up.
Yeah.
It's significant, and you can see the realness as well. It's just interesting to look at before I see this kind of like trying to be feeling uncomfortable to this. Oh, this makes sense, you know, and it's so hard sometimes to put into words, you know, and that's why probably so many people find it difficult to understand and comprehend and identify with, because sometimes it's something that if you saw happen in front of your eyes, you would understand it without maybe being able to put words to it. You hit the nail on the head. It is about personal happiness. All that matters is someone is happy, you know, and free and living.
Well, I mean, I guess it's sort of, I mean, I think about it in these terms. I've just knocked the table my computer's on. I shall stop it. There we go. Otherwise, James will beat the crap out of me after the show for being unprofessional. Got a bit overexcited. Sorry, James. But sort of, did I lose my train of thought? I think I just lost my train of thought. What was I saying?
Happiness.
Yeah. Oh no, that's what I was saying. I'm thinking about this thing about what's in it for the rest of us. So you get personal happiness, but the other thing that's happening is that I've seen a transformation in the way you engage with the world, and this is the thing that people don't factor in. Is this, and it's a thing called it's a way of thinking about how society works called asset-based community development. And the question always is, why would we as a culture invest in X, Y, or Z, excluded group, because what happens is that when people can heal in situ in their community, they then start to put back in rather than take away. And so historically, because of your psychological state, you were harming yourself, you were using a drain on society, if you like, in very simplistic terms. Now you're a contributor to society, and that's what's in it for the rest of us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Ripple effect as well, you know, one person getting the effects that can have on other people.
Absolutely, and that's why it's important that we invest in this stuff. Because we're going to pay for it one way or another. So we're going to pay for it in people turning up to psych wards because they've tried to kill themselves, or we're going to pay for it because, you know, somebody's got tanked up and sort of ended up sort of blacked out in the middle of the road, etc., etc. So and then we pay for the ambulance and the hospital, and so one way or another we're going to pay for it. And it seems to me bonkers that we would pay for the consequences of people destroying themselves rather than pay for people being able to become truly happy about themselves and contribute positively to the world. And when it's put in those terms, I think most people can understand, oh, that makes sense. That absolutely makes sense. And there's a great image from this development theory called asset-based community development. It's sort of, you imagine a row of houses, sort of a Victorian terrace row, and you would say in that house is a drunk, and in that house is drug use, and that house is and you can take those people out, right, and you can treat them and then move them somewhere else. You're still left with the other people. But if you don't, if you leave people there and you give them the services they need in that place, what happens is this really remarkable thing where they get well in public in front of everybody else, and they inspire other people to change for the better. And then the next person along does that. Okay. Now we have this evidence from community. We also have it as an employment thing. And so employment policies around mental health are very much now try and keep people in work and let them get well while they're at work so that everybody can see it. So all those people that are subclinical struggling are probably going to become clinical at some point and become a drain on you, and you'll lose them, they will seek help sooner. And it's a virtuous circle from a vicious cycle. And that's what's in it for us as a culture. We create a virtuous circle, right? And otherwise, we're literally digging our own grave as a society, and we're just creating a situation in which deficits and problems grow and grow and grow, and that's the point of it. I think that's sort of what's in it for all of us. Since you've gone through this sort of period of the dark soul last year, and you've come to terms with yourself, what are you working on currently, and how can people sort of see you and connect with you, and what platforms are you on, what projects are you working on, and how can we know more about you?
I'm very visible on social media, so if anyone wants to follow my journey, I'm at Becoming Jude, and I've got a website, and I've done, since obviously I mentioned that COVID hit, and it kind of really stopped me from going out and doing my public speaking work, which I was doing a lot of. I'm doing that again, and I'm using Zoom platforms, but I've been speaking to businesses, schools all over the country. I'm doing talks for fire and rescue services and all kind of different organizations, just anyone that kind of needs the knowledge and the awareness. And so I do a lot of that. So if anyone wants to get in touch and wants trans awareness training, my story, whatever, that's you can get in touch via the Instagram on my website, which is again www.becomingjude.com. And I've kind of made this Becoming Jude a bit of a brand, like it's my experience in becoming who I am. And my authenticity kind of being my superpower, and so I do a lot of the public speaking work, and obviously I'm doing a lot of modeling now as well, and that my kind of life is kind of expanding on that front too. And I just fronted a Harrods campaign, well, just last summer, but that's kind of being revived at the moment, and hoping to do much more. There's a few things in the pipeline coming up, but I'm not going to get too excited. I'm going to not jinx it and see whether they come into fruition, but we'll see. But if anyone wants to know more, please do get in touch, because I'm happy to answer questions and kind of if anything's sort of touched anyone more.
And I think the thing that strikes me, Jude, why I would sort of promote you is that you're you've done the transformation in so many ways, but the sense of you as a comfortable human being really comes across. And if you're a parent and you've got a really upset kid who's confused about these issues, they can become unupset really quickly by being able to meet people like Jude and discover that it's going to be all right.
And
I just need to be yourself.
I've met these kids in schools. I've met the trans kids, and often they'll come out to me, and they're so afraid of coming out to their friends, their teachers, their parents. And I've met people that unfortunately didn't make the fight because of and that unfortunately are the statistics. I've met so many of these people across the country. Often I haven't, because they've been in the psych ward. But I've met these kids, and they're just wonderful, wonderful human beings, and they're just so desperately wanting to be accepted and live and celebrate who they are. And they do see someone come in, and like, I'm kind of excuse me, I won't swear, but no shit, Jules. Jude, sorry. So see, I do it to myself.
I sorry, that's my fault.
Yeah, like
reminding you of Jules.
I did it yesterday on the phone to my agent, but when I'm stood up on stage and I'm like, this is who I am, and I don't care what anyone thinks, and I love this about myself, and I'm proud.
It's also, I think one of the great things, and we're talking about this before the show, we need to finish now, but I think we'll finish on this, is that talking to you, I'm partly because I know you, but also because of who you are. It's just a comfortable conversation, and I think a lot of people are uncomfortable about the conversation, and some of the people who maybe are advocates in the field make it uncomfortable as well. I mean, that's inevitable, but you don't. I mean, you make it very easy to make mistakes, because we're going through cultural transitions around this. We're trying to wrap our heads around it, get the right words, have the conversations, so we get to know each other.
I've just done it myself, to myself.
It's all right. It's not the end of the world, is it?
No, it's fine, because we're all
leave it there. It's the end of the show, though, I'm afraid. Did you like that? The way I did that? It's quite good. I thought that. Anyway, it is the end of the show. It's been lovely to catch up with you again. I'll see. Now you're in London. I'm sort of coming back next week, so I'll drop you a line. We'll go and have a coffee because it's illegal.
I would love that.
We're allowed to do that again.
Coffee shop, sit outside.
It's great. All right. On me. The coffee's on me. And lovely to see you. And great to have everybody with us this evening. It's been a fantastic show. And I'll be back in Blighty next week. We've got another show on. Don't know. Actually, no. We don't know who it is yet. We haven't found a person for next week. So if anybody would like to be on the show next week, give us a bell. You can. All right. That's the end of us. Bye-bye, folks. You stay with us, Jude. And see you all next week. Bye-bye.